Taman pressed his face close to the cold glass of the shuttle window and stared at the station floating in the darkness ahead. It was enormous. The pale threshold, they called it. A ring of metal and light spinning slowly around a dead star that gave off no warmth. Every powerful species in the galaxy had sent their leaders here. And now, for the first time in history, humanity had been invited too. He did not feel welcome. 15 years ago, Earth had been nothing to the galaxy. Humans were just another species crawling around on a small blue rock in an unimportant corner of space. Then they figured out how to travel faster than light. The signal was detected, and everything changed. Within months, alien ships appeared in Earth's solar system. Not to greet them, not to celebrate, but to watch, to measure, and eventually, to pressure. Trade restrictions came first, then border sanctions, then military patrols along every route Earth tried to use. Humanity was boxed in, surrounded by species that had been building empires for thousands of years. And now, after 15 years of silence and slow suffocation, the galaxy's rulers had finally decided to let humans sit at the table. But not as equals. Dohan stood at the front of the shuttle, hands clasped behind his back. He was Earth's head diplomat, a tall man with a calm face and quiet eyes that never seemed to blink at the wrong time. He had spent 30 years negotiating between nations back on Earth before the galaxy came calling. Now he carried the weight of an entire species on his shoulders, and he carried it the way he carried everything, without complaint, without hurry. He turned to face the small team behind him. There were only 4 of them. Yuna, his second-in-command, sat with her legs crossed and a tablet resting on her knee. She was a military strategist, and her mind worked like a machine that only understood angles and outcomes. Hana sat in the corner, silent as always, her dark eyes watching nothing and everything at the same time. She was intelligence. No one knew exactly what she did, and that was the point. And then there was Taman, the youngest, the communications officer who still believed that words could change things. Dohan spoke simply. The Assembly of 12 had called them here to sign something called the Valen Accord. It sounded official. It sounded fair. It was neither. The accord would give humanity access to a single colony system and limited trade with 3 species. In return, humanity would accept permanent caps on its military. No warship above a certain size. No weapons research beyond a certain level. Alien inspectors would be allowed into human labs, human shipyards, and human schools to make sure the rules were followed. And humanity would submit to the legal authority of the Assembly, meaning any dispute between humans and aliens would be judged by alien courts, under alien laws, by alien judges. Yuna looked up from her tablet and said what everyone was already thinking. This was not a negotiation. It was a caller. Dohan did not argue with her. He simply asked if she had run the projections. She had. If humanity signed the accord, they would remain a dependent species for at least 300 years. No growth, no expansion, no voice. They would exist at the pleasure of others, and the moment they became inconvenient, they would be erased. Hana spoke next, and the room got a little colder. She had intercepted encrypted communications between the Orvon Dominion and the Caliph Pact, the 2 most powerful factions in the Assembly. The messages made one thing very clear. Those 2 empires had already divided human border space between themselves. They had drawn lines on maps that cut through human territory like it belonged to no one. And they had done this before the summit even started. It did not matter what humanity signed. The outcome had already been decided. Taman felt his chest tighten. He looked at Dohan, searching for something. Anger, fear, maybe even despair. But Dohan's face showed none of it. The man simply nodded, as if Hana had told him the weather. The shuttle docked, the doors opened, and the human delegation stepped onto the pale threshold. The station was beautiful in the way that powerful things often are, cold, polished, and designed to make visitors feel small. The corridors were wide enough for species 3 times the size of humans. The lighting shifted, depending on which section they walked through, tuned to the comfort of whichever alien species controlled that part of the station. No section was tuned for humans. They were led to the summit hall by a pair of guards who did not speak to them. The hall was a massive circular room with a domed ceiling that showed the stars outside. 12 thrones were arranged in a wide circle, each one elevated on a platform. Each throne was different, carved from stone, grown from crystal, shaped from living metal, representing the 12 most powerful species in the galaxy. In the center of the circle, on the floor level, was a single chair, plain, low, undecorated. That was humanity's seat. Taman stopped walking for a moment when he saw it. The insult was not subtle. It was not meant to be. But Dohan did not pause. He walked straight to the chair and sat down. He crossed one leg over the other, rested his hands on his knee, and smiled politely at the 12 rulers, staring down at him from their thrones. Grand Ruler Vorath of the Orvan Dominion spoke first. He was ancient. His gray skin pulled tight over a skull that looked like it had been carved from the same stone as his throne. His voice filled the room, the way cold fills an empty house. He welcomed humanity to the fold of civilization. He spoke about guidance, patience, and the generosity of the elder species who had chosen to extend their hand to a young and unproven race. He made it sound like a gift. Every word was a chain wrapped in silk. The other rulers watched. Some nodded. Some looked bored. Warlord Dren of the Caliph Pact picked at something on his armored gauntlet and did not even look at the humans. Emissary Luné of the Shawl Collective watched Dohan carefully, her 4 eyes blinking in a pattern that suggested worry. When Vorath finished, the hall waited for humanity's response. Dohan said nothing. He simply smiled and tilted his head in a small bow of acknowledgement. Then he leaned slightly toward Yuna, who sat just behind him, and whispered something only she could hear. They have already decided what we are. Let us show them what that costs. Yuna's expression did not change, but her hand moved to her tablet, and she began to type. The first day of the summit began with the reading of the Valen Accord. It was long. It was detailed. And every single clause was designed to take something from humanity and give nothing back. The alien delegates read each section aloud, with the tone of people who had already decided the outcome. Military tonnage limits that would prevent Earth from building anything larger than a patrol frigate. Research oversight clauses that gave alien inspectors the authority to enter any human laboratory at any time without warning. Cultural integration programs that required human children to study alien history, alien philosophy, and alien law, but made no mention of teaching alien children anything about Earth. Taman sat behind Dohan and listened with his jaw tight and his hands pressed flat against his knees. He wanted to stand up. He wanted to shout. Every clause was another slap wrapped in formal language. And the worst part was how casual the aliens were about it. They were not nervous. They were not careful. They read the terms the way someone reads a grocery list. Bored, routine, already thinking about what comes next. But Dohan did something no one in that room expected. He listened. He listened to every clause, every subclause, every footnote. And when each section was finished, he asked questions. Polite questions. Precise questions. He asked about the definition of military tonnage. Did it include civilian ships that could be converted? He asked about the research oversight. Who appointed the inspectors, and who reviewed their findings? He asked about the cultural programs. Were they mandatory for all age groups, or only children under a certain age? The questions were calm, they were reasonable, and they made the alien delegates deeply uncomfortable. Grand Ruler Vorath watched from his throne, with narrowing eyes. He had done this before, hundreds of times, with dozens of species. Young races were predictable. They either signed immediately out of fear, or they protested loudly and emotionally, which gave the assembly a reason to dismiss them. Dohan did neither. He simply asked questions that no one wanted to answer. By the end of the first day, the mood in the hall had shifted. Several delegates whispered to each other. Emissary Lune of the Shal Collective kept glancing at the human delegation with an expression that sat somewhere between admiration and dread. During the evening recess, Lune found Hana in one of the station's lower corridors. The alien emissary was smaller than most of her kind, with pale blue skin and 4 eyes that moved independently of each other. She spoke quickly and quietly. She told Hana that the Orvan Dominion would not accept any changes to the accord, not a single word. The treaty was never meant to be negotiated. It was meant to be signed. Humanity's role was to accept, smile, and disappear into the background of galactic politics. Hana thanked her. Her face showed nothing. She filed every word into the quiet archive behind her eyes and walked away. That same evening, in a different corridor, Warlord Dren found Yuna. Dren was massive. His species, the Caliph, were built for war the way mountains are built for standing. He towered over Yuna by more than a full meter, his scarred face looking down at her with the confidence of someone who had personally ended civilizations. He told her that his fleet could burn Earth's moon to glass in a single attack run. He said it casually, the way someone might mention the weather. He wanted her to flinch. Yuna looked up at him. She did not step back. She did not blink. She said 4 words. "You could. Once." Then she walked past him and continued down the corridor without looking back. Dren stood alone in the hallway for a long time after that. It was not the words that unsettled him. It was her eyes. There had been no fear in them. None at all. And Dren, who had spent his entire life surrounded by fear, did not know what to do with its absence. The second day began with hope. At least, it did for Taman. Dohan stood before the assembly and presented humanity's counterproposal. It was a carefully built document, reasonable in every way. It asked for genuine equality, mutual military inspections, not just alien inspectors in human labs, but human inspectors in alien ones too. Shared scientific research, reciprocal trade rights, and a seat on the assembly with a vote equal to every other species. It was fair. It was balanced. It was everything a real peace treaty should be. Grand Ruler Vorath rejected it in under 4 minutes. He did not allow the full document to be read. He waved one long gray hand and said that the ambitions of a species that had not earned its place were not worthy of the assembly's time. 2 other rulers murmured in agreement. Dren did not even look up. Dohan stood still for a moment. The silence in the hall was heavy, the kind of silence that presses against your chest. Then he nodded once, slowly, deliberately, and asked for a recess. In the private chamber behind the hall, the human delegation gathered. Taman was shaking, not with fear, but with anger so deep it made his vision blur. He asked Dohan how he could stand there and be treated like that, how he could nod and smile, while they spat on everything humanity had built. Dohan looked at him with those quiet, steady eyes, and said nothing for a moment. Then he told Taman that anger was not a weakness, but it was also not a plan. They needed something sharper than anger right now. Yuna laid out the military situation. The alien fleet movements along human borders had increased since the talks began. Ships were being repositioned. Supply lines were being extended. The assembly was not waiting for humanity to sign. They were preparing to take what they wanted, regardless. Hana confirmed it. Her intercepted communications painted a clear picture. The Orvan Dominion and the Caliph Pact had agreed to a joint military operation along human borders. The timetable was already set. The summit was just a stage performance to give the invasion a legal cover. The room went very quiet. Dohan reached into his coat and pulled out a small communication device. He opened a secure channel and spoke a name. Admiral Sunho. There was static, then a voice. Calm, steady, military. Dohan asked a single question. Are we ready? We are ready. Dohan closed the channel and looked at his team. He looked at Yuna, whose face was carved from ice. He looked at Hana, whose silence said more than words ever could. He looked at Taemin, whose anger had turned into something harder and more useful. He told them that they had come here to give the galaxy a chance, a real chance at peace, and the galaxy had made its choice. Now it was time for humanity to make its own. They stood, they straightened their clothes, and they walked back toward the summit hall, not to sign, not to argue, and not to beg. They walked back to do something no species in the history of the assembly had ever done before. The summit hall was full again. Every throne was occupied. Every aide and advisor stood at their stations along the curved walls. The great dome above showed the stars turning slowly as the station rotated around its dead sun. The Assembly of 12 had reconvened, and the air itself seemed to wait. Grand Ruler Vorath sat on his stone throne with the satisfaction of someone who knew exactly how the next hour would unfold. He had seen this scene 100 times before. A young species would come back from recess with red eyes and shaking hands, and they would sign. They always signed, because the alternative was worse, and every species in the galaxy understood that. Warlord Dren leaned back in his seat and examined the edge of his gauntlet with the boredom of a man already planning what came after. Emissary Lune sat very still, her 4 eyes focused entirely on the human delegation as they walked back into the hall. She was the only one in the room who looked afraid. Dohan walked to the center of the circle. He did not sit in the low chair this time. He stood beside it, hands at his sides, and he looked up at the 12 rulers arranged above him. His face was calm. His breathing was even. There was nothing dramatic about the way he carried himself. He looked like a man about to give a weather report. Then he spoke. He did not wait to be invited. He did not ask for permission. He simply began, and the room was so surprised that no one stopped him. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The hall was designed to carry sound from the center to every corner, and Dohan's words moved through the silence like a blade through still water. He started with the beginning. 15 years ago, he said, when humanity first reached the stars, they had looked outward with hope. They had imagined what it would be like to meet other minds, other civilizations, other ways of seeing the universe. They had dreamed of partnership, of friendship, of learning and growing alongside species that had walked among the stars for millennia. Instead, they found walls. He recounted each one. The trade restrictions that prevented human merchants from operating outside their own system. The border patrols that turned back human exploration vessels with weapons locked and ready. The diplomatic channels that were always busy, always delayed, always leading nowhere. 15 years of closed doors and cold shoulders, dressed up in the language of patience and protocol. Then, he turned to the Valen Accord itself. Clause by clause, he laid it bare, not with anger, but with the flat precision of a surgeon describing a wound. Military caps designed to keep humanity permanently weak. Research restrictions designed to keep humanity permanently behind. Cultural programs designed not to integrate, but to erase. A judicial system in which humanity had no voice and no vote, but was expected to obey. The hall was silent. Several delegates shifted in their thrones. 1 or 2 looked away. And then Dohan did something that changed everything. He pulled out a small device and projected a series of documents into the air above him. Holographic text that every being in the room could read in their own language. They were the intercepted communications, the private messages between the Orvan Dominion and the Caliph Pact. The ones that showed how those 2 empires had already divided human border space between themselves. Maps with lines drawn through human territory. Timetables for military positioning, logistics plans for an occupation that was scheduled to begin within weeks, regardless of whether humanity signed the accord or not. The reaction was immediate. 3 delegates rose from their seats. Two others turned to stare at Vorath and Dren with expressions that ranged from disbelief to fury. Emissary Lune closed all four of her eyes and lowered her head, because she had already known, and the weight of that knowledge had been crushing her for days. Vorath's face changed. The smooth confidence cracked, just for a moment, and something older and uglier showed through. The cold calculation of a ruler who had been caught, not in a lie, but in an assumption. He had assumed it would not matter. He had assumed that no one would ever see those messages, because no one ever looked twice at what happened to a species as small as humanity. Dohan let the silence hold. He let every ruler in that room sit with what they had just seen. And then he said the words that would be remembered for 1,000 years. You did not invite us here to make peace. You invited us here to rehearse our surrender. We decline the role. He walked toward the great doors of the summit hall with the same steady, unhurried pace he had carried since the first day. He did not look back. Yuna stood and followed him. Her boots made sharp, clean sounds against the floor. Hana rose like smoke and moved after them without making any sound at all. Vorath's voice boomed across the hall, commanding the humans to return to their seats. Dren slammed one massive fist against the arm of his throne and snarled something in his own language that the translators rendered as a threat involving fire and extinction. Other delegates shouted over each other, their voices tangling into a noise that filled the dome like a storm. The humans did not stop. Taman was the last one standing. He looked around the hall at the most powerful beings in the galaxy, ancient rulers who controlled fleets and worlds and the lives of billions. They were shouting. They were confused. They were afraid. And they were afraid, because 4 humans had stood up and walked toward the door. Taman straightened his jacket. He looked at Vorath, then at Dren, then at Lune, and in a gesture so human it would confuse alien scholars for generations, he placed one hand over his chest and bowed, a deep, respectful, final bow. Not mocking, not sarcastic, just the quiet courtesy of someone saying goodbye to people he would never sit beneath again. Then he turned and walked through the doors, and they sealed shut behind him. On the shuttle, moving fast away from the pale threshold, Dohan sat down at the communications console. His hands moved quickly. He opened a broadcast channel, wideband, unencrypted, maximum range. The signal would reach every ship, every station, every relay beacon, every colony, and every homeworld within range. He transmitted everything. The full, unedited transcript of the summit, every clause of the Valen Accord, every intercepted communication, every map, every timetable, every private message the Orvan Dominion and Calith Pact had exchanged while planning to carve up human space like a meal. The galaxy was about to learn the truth, not from rumors, not from politicians, from the raw, unfiltered record of what had happened in that room. Yuna watched the transmission progress bar fill on her screen. Hana monitored the alien communication channels and reported that the station was already in chaos. Delegates scrambling, encrypted channels flooding with traffic, at least 3 species recalling their ambassadors from Orvan space. Taman sat by the window again, looking back at the pale threshold as it shrank into the distance. It still looked enormous, it still looked powerful, but something had changed. It no longer looked invincible. Back in the summit hall, the shouting had stopped. The great dome showed the same cold stars it always had. The 12 thrones, now meaningless in a circle that had been broken, looked down at an empty chair in the center of the room. The low, plain, undecorated chair where humanity was supposed to sit and accept its place. It was empty. And Grand Ruler Vorath, for the first time in his 10,000 years of rule, did not know what to do next. The broadcast hit the galaxy like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples spread fast, and they spread far, and nothing they touched stayed the same. Within hours, Dohan's transmission had been received, copied, translated, and shared across thousands of worlds. News networks on alien planets ran the story before their governments could decide how to respond. The full transcript of the summit, every condescending word from Vorath, every threat from Dren, every clause of the Valen Accord was laid bare for the entire galaxy to read. And beside it, the intercepted communications, the private maps, the invasion timetables, the proof that the two most powerful empires in the Assembly had planned to swallow humanity whole before the ink on the treaty was even dry. Some species were angry, and some, particularly the smaller ones who had signed their own versions of the Valen Accord generations ago, read the transcript and felt something they had not felt in a very long time. The memory of what it was like to be told your place. On Earth, the reaction was unlike anything the planet had seen since the first alien ships appeared in the sky 15 years earlier. But this time, it was not fear. It was not confusion. It was a single unified exhale, the sound of 8 billion people deciding, at roughly the same moment, that they were done being quiet. Every faction, every government, every political party set aside its differences. Emergency sessions were held in every capital. Military leaders coordinated openly for the first time in years. Civilian factories began converting their production lines, not because anyone ordered them to, but because the workers walked in and started doing it on their own. Shipyards that had been building freighters started building warships. Research labs that had been idle under the threat of alien inspections reopened their doors and went to work. It was not panic. Panic runs in circles. This moved in straight lines. Admiral Sunho deployed the first expeditionary fleet within 48 hours. The fleet was not large by galactic standards. Earth had been restricted for too long, and the ships it had were fewer and smaller than what the great empires could field. But they were positioned with extraordinary precision. Yuna had spent years building contingency plans for exactly this moment, and every ship, every formation, every supply line was placed exactly where it needed to be. The fleet did not advance. It did not threaten. It simply existed, in the right places, at the right time, in a pattern that told anyone with military experience, we know what you are planning, and we are ready. The first crack in the Galactic Coalition came from the Shal Collective. Emissary Lune had returned to her homeworld, carrying the weight of what she had seen at the summit. She stood before the Collective's governing council and told them everything. Not just the public transcript, but the private moments. The fear in the hall when Dohan spoke. The silence when the intercepted messages were revealed. The sound of 4 pairs of boots walking out of a room that no species had ever left voluntarily. The Shal Collective voted within a day. They refused to join any military action against humanity. They recalled their ships from the Assembly's joint fleet, and quietly, through back channels that Hana had already prepared, they opened trade negotiations with Earth. Lune contacted Hana directly, on a secure line. Her voice was steady, but tired. She said something that Hana would remember for a long time. Your people have more friends than you know. You just forced them to choose a side. 3 more species followed the Shal within the week. Small empires, mid-tier powers, species that had lived under the shadow of the Orvan Dominion for centuries, and had never had a reason to step out of it. Humanity's walkout had not just embarrassed the Assembly. It had shattered the illusion that the Assembly was unbreakable. Warlord Dren did not wait for politics. He was a soldier, and soldiers solved problems the old way. He assembled a strike force, fast, heavy, overwhelming, and launched a punitive raid on a human border colony called New Incheon. It was supposed to be easy. A small colony, lightly defended, far from Earth. A quick strike to remind the galaxy that humans were still small and still breakable. The raid lasted 11 hours. Dren expected to meet scattered patrol ships and civilian defense platforms. Instead, he found a defense network that had no right to exist. Human ships appeared from positions that should have been empty. They fought in ways no galactic power had ever encountered. Decentralized formations that had no clear command ship. adaptive tactics that changed mid-battle, and a willingness to sacrifice individual vessels in ways that turned every engagement into a trap. One human frigate rammed itself into the side of a Caliph cruiser at full speed, crippling the larger ship and opening a gap that 3 more human vessels poured through. Dren's force was not destroyed, but it was mauled, badly. He lost a quarter of his ships and retreated with damage reports that his own admirals refused to believe until they saw the footage. The punitive raid, meant to show human weakness, became the loudest possible demonstration of human defiance. Back in the Orvan Dominion, Grand Ruler Vorath was dealing with a different kind of battle. His coalition was falling apart. The intercepted communications that Dohan had broadcast did more damage than any weapon. 3 more species quietly withdrew from the Assembly's unified military stance. Ambassadors were recalled. Trade agreements were frozen. The trust that held the Assembly together, never strong to begin with, but functional, had been broken in a way that could not be repaired with speeches or threats. Vorath was furious. Not just at the humans, though he hated them now with a depth that surprised even him. He was furious at himself. He had underestimated them. He had treated them like every other young species, frightened, isolated, desperate for approval, and he had been wrong. Humans were not frightened, and patience, he was learning, was far more dangerous than fear. On the front line, Taman stood in the medical bay of the New Incheon colony and helped treat civilians who had been wounded in Dren's raid. A woman with burns on her arms, a child who had lost hearing in one ear from an explosion, an old man who sat in the corner and said nothing, holding a photograph of a house that no longer existed. That night, Taman sat in his small quarters on the outpost and wrote a letter. He did not write it to anyone in particular. He wrote it for everyone. He wrote about the medical bay and the people in it. He wrote about the old man and the photograph. He wrote about what it felt like to stand in a room full of wounded people and know that this had happened because someone in a throne had decided that humanity did not deserve to say no. The letter was published across Earth's networks 3 days later. It was read by millions. It was translated into dozens of languages. And it became, in the quiet way that true things become important, a symbol of why humanity was fighting. Not for territory, not for revenge, not for empire, but for the simple, stubborn, unbreakable right to exist on their own terms. 6 weeks after the walkout, Vorath called an emergency session of the Assembly. He sent formal summons to all 12 species. Only 7 answered. 5 thrones sat empty. The circle that had ruled the galaxy for millennia was broken, and everyone in the room knew it. Vorath looked at the empty seats, and for the second time in his long life, did not know what to do. But this time, there were no humans to blame. The humans were far away, building something the galaxy had never seen, a coalition of the willing, held together not by power or fear, but by the simple, radical idea that every species deserved to stand at the same height. 6 months had passed since the walkout, and the galaxy looked nothing like it did before. The Assembly of 12 was now the Assembly of 8, and even that number was generous. 4 species had formally broken away and established independent alliances, most of them with Earth at the center. The Shawl Collective, once a quiet trade federation that avoided conflict the way water avoids fire, had become humanity's strongest galactic partner. Their trade ships now moved freely through human space, and human engineers worked side by side with Shawl scientists on projects that neither species could have built alone. The Orvan Dominion was still powerful. Grand Ruler Vorath still sat on his stone throne and commanded fleets that could darken the skies of 100 worlds. But power without trust is just weight, and the weight was pressing down on him from every direction. Former allies no longer answered his calls promptly. Trade routes that had been open for centuries were now tangled in new agreements that did not include his empire. The galaxy had not turned against him. It had simply started to turn without him. Warlord Dren of the Caliph Pact was in worse shape. His failed raid on New Incheon had not only cost him ships, it had cost him reputation. Among his own people, reputation was everything. A warrior who attacks the weak and still loses is not a warrior at all. His generals questioned him behind closed doors. His allies looked elsewhere for strength. The great warlord who had once boasted that he could burn Earth's moon to glass now sat in council chambers defending himself against whispers. Both of them, reluctantly and for their own reasons, agreed to new peace talks. But this time, the terms were different in every way. Humanity set the location. Humanity chose the format. And humanity issued the invitations. The new summit was held aboard the EFS Resolve, Admiral Sun Ho's flagship, a human warship orbiting Earth. The ship was not the largest vessel in the fleet, but it was the heart of it. Its hull carried scars from the defense of New Incheon, still visible, deliberately unrepaired. They were not signs of damage, they were proof. The alien delegations arrived one by one. Their shuttles docked in the Resolve's hangar bay, and they were greeted warmly. Human officers in clean uniforms shook hands, or the equivalent, with alien diplomats who had never set foot on a human ship before. The corridors were plain and functional, lit by white light that did not shift or adjust for anyone's comfort. It was the same light for everyone. That was the point. The summit room was simple. A round table, chairs of equal height, no thrones, no platforms, no center seat placed lower than the rest. Every seat was the same, and every species sat at the same level. Vorath noticed it the moment he walked in. He said nothing, but his jaw tightened by a fraction that only Dohan would have caught. Dohan opened the summit. He stood at his place at the table, not above it, not in front of it, just at it, and he spoke. His tone was different now. The cold precision from the pale threshold was gone. In its place was something open, almost gentle. He told the room that humanity did not want an empire. They had no interest in revenge. They had not walked out of the last summit to make enemies. They had walked out because they refused to make themselves less than what they were. And now, they were here to offer what should have been offered from the beginning. A real partnership between equals, built on respect. Yuna presented the treaty. They called it the Soul Accord, named after the city on Earth where the document had been written by a team of human and Shal diplomats working together for 3 months. It was built on the same principles as the counter-proposal that Vorath had rejected in 4 minutes at the pale threshold. But it was broader now, shaped by 6 months of reality. Mutual defense agreements. If one species was attacked, the others would respond, not as servants, but as partners. Shared scientific research, with results belonging to all participating species equally. Open trade, with fair tariffs and transparent regulations. Cultural exchange programs that went both ways. Humans learning alien history, and aliens learning human history. No inspectors, no restrictions, no leashes. And at the center of it all, a new galactic council where every species, whether they had been traveling the stars for 10,000 years or 15, had an equal voice and an equal vote. Emissary Lune read through the document carefully, her 4 eyes moving across the text at a speed that made Taman dizzy to watch. When she finished, she set down her tablet and looked at Dohan. She said that in her lifetime, she had signed dozens of treaties. Most of them were written by the powerful to control the weak. This was the first one she had ever read that was written by the strong to lift everyone up. She signed it. The Shal Collective was the first. 3 other species followed within the hour. Small empires that had broken away from the assembly. Mid-tier powers that had been watching and waiting. They signed with relief, with hope, and with the cautious optimism of people who had been burned before, but were willing to try again. He arrived at the summit with his armor polished and his expression carved from stone. He sat through the presentation without speaking, his massive arms crossed over his chest. When the floor was opened for discussion, he did not ask about trade routes or defense agreements. He looked directly at Yuna and asked her a question that surprised everyone. He asked her what humans fought for. Yuna met his gaze without hesitation. She told him that humans did not fight because they wanted to win. They fought because they refused to kneel. Winning was a result. The refusal was the principle. Dren was silent for a long time. Then he uncrossed his arms, picked up the stylus, and signed the accord. As he set it down, he looked at Yuna again, and said, quietly enough that only those nearby could hear, that he had spent his whole life measuring strength by what a species could destroy. He had never considered measuring it by what a species would endure. Vorath was the last. He sat at the table with his ancient gray hands flat on the surface and his eyes fixed on Doan. The room was quiet. Everyone knew that this moment would define everything that came after. Without the Orvan Dominion, the accord would work, but it would work with a crack running through it. With them, it could become something real, something lasting. Vorath spoke slowly. He said that in 10,000 years of rule, across hundreds of treaties and dozens of conquered worlds, no species had ever simply walked away from his assembly. They had fought, they had begged, they had surrendered, but none of them had ever just stood up, turned around, and left. He admitted that when the humans walked out, he did not know what to do. And for a ruler who had always known what to do, that silence was the most terrifying thing he had ever experienced. He looked at the Soul Accord. He read it one more time. And then he signed it. Not graciously, not warmly, but he signed it. And in doing so, he acknowledged something his empire had never acknowledged before. That power alone was not enough to hold a galaxy together. The room exhaled. Taman watched from the observation deck above the summit room, leaning against the railing with his arms folded. Beside him, Hana stood in her usual silence, watching the delegates below shake hands and exchange the careful, fragile first words of a new era. Taman asked her if she thought it would last, the peace, the respect, the idea that every species could stand at the same height. Hana looked out through the wide window at the curve of Earth below them, blue and white and impossibly bright against the black. She said that it did not matter if it lasted. What mattered was that they showed the galaxy it was possible. Below the ship, Earth turned slowly in the light of its sun. Around the Resolve, ships from a dozen species held formation. Shal traders, Kalith warships with their weapons powered down, Orvan cruisers flying alongside human frigates for the first time in history. It was not a fleet, it was a statement. In his quarters, alone, Dohan sat at his desk. In front of him lay the original Valen Accord, the document that humanity had been expected to sign at the Pale Threshold, the document that would have made them a servant species for 300 years. He picked it up, looked at it one last time, and folded it once down the middle. He set it on the corner of his desk, stood up, and walked out to join the others. He left the door open behind him. He would not be coming back to this room tonight. There was celebrating to do, and for the first time in a very long time, humanity had something worth celebrating. Outside the window, the stars stretched on forever. The same stars that every species in the galaxy shared, whether they had been watching them for 10,000 years or only 15. And for the first time, those stars did not look like borders or battlefields or prizes to be won. They looked like what they had always been, a place big enough for everyone.